Hi, everybody. Welcome to the March 30th, 2018 edition of Colorado Inside Out. I'm your host, Dominic Dezzutti. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's get a quick take on this week's decision from the Colorado Public Utilities Commission to phase out the flaggers at RTD's A-line crossings. Patty Calhoun from Westward. Well, if RTD is now going to be saving some money on the flaggers now being gone, do you think quiet zones are somehow on the horizon?
No, because actually I think it's the company that was supposed to have finished the A-line properly, 2 years ago, has been eating this one. It's the loneliest job in Colorado, being the flagger at the A-line, so glad they're removing them. Let's just hope everything is still working.
David Kopel from the Independence Institute and DU Law School. Seeing the flaggers finally go away, but there's still being issues between quiet zones and everything else, is this showing that RTD rolled out the A-line too soon?
No, RTD never does anything too soon. They also have the G-line with similar issues in the flaggers, and they are not yet free of them on either the G-line, which is supposed to open maybe later this year, maybe the year after, nor on the A-line. But in terms of their speed, RTD was created in 1970 with a massive tax hike for everybody in the metro area. They promised in 1970 that by 1980 we would have 119 miles of fixed rail guideways. If the G-line ever opens, which is 35 miles long, that will by 2018 bring RTD's total fixed rail miles to 112. Almost at the 119 they were supposed to have back in 1980. And if they can just open one more line before 2020, they will have met their goal within 40 years after they promised it was going to get done.
Penfield Tate, attorney at QTAC Rock, also a longtime state lawmaker. Probably pretty predictable we were going to get a good, funny answer from Mr. Kopel. What do you think about this? Does this announcement put the A-line back on track? Sorry.
No, but, you know, David's preoccupation with details notwithstanding, I think we ought to say this is good news for RTD, and it's an agency that needed some good news. You know, it's a step forward. They've still got a lot of work to do, and it's over the years I've been critical of RTD because I think it's an agency with the best of intentions that struggles with implementation on almost everything it does and struggles with public perception. And David's point is a valid one. They promised to have certain things done by 1980, and, you know, several years later, they're not even at that point yet. But this is a positive step forward, and let's congratulate them for that and hope they get the G-line open in a reasonably timely fashion, and we can move forward and maybe start building some ridership on some of these lines.
John Bowman rounds out the panel from 5 Points News. John, does this buy some credibility? We don't see the A-line breaking down as often. The flaggers now being able to go home. Maybe the quiet zones can happen, I don't know. But does this get some credibility back and taking away some of those headlines that we saw months ago when it was just if the A-line was running today?
I don't know that you can even ask that when we sit here on the line to nowhere. We're sitting in 5 Points on a line to nowhere. This was the first line built. It was supposed to go all the way up to Smith Road and out to the airport. But you had a bunch of black ministers, basically, who were promised some money to be positive about this new line through 5 Points. But they came out with, we didn't get any money, so we're against the line going any further than 30th and Downing. So that's why it stops right there. This is the most lucrative. You talk about nothing getting done. The cops on that detail were making $55 an hour. The regular civilians were making $13 an hour. The Post did a story about a year ago on how much money had been spent on these flaggers. These guys made big money. It's $55 million or something, or $10 million, I'm sorry, $10 million. So the cops out there, if you look at the cops that are sitting in their cars, those are all brand new cars with new tags on the license plate. Everybody made money off of this. The bottom line is, I live in Park Hill. I hear the horns at night. It takes me back to, you know, going somewhere as a kid reading a book. But if you live close to Smith Road, it's a nightmare.
Well, in a 42-22 vote, Colorado House members approved its own version of the 2018-19 budget this week. The long bill from the House contains a variety of amendments that are not likely to make it out of the Senate Appropriations Committee, which is where the bill is headed to next. Patty, approving the budget is the biggest job our legislature has every year, but we often hear about the long bill, a lot of different details, and this time we have two pretty different versions. What version do you think is going to be the one that looks most like the final one that we see approved later this session?
Neither. There's going to be plenty of fights going on. There were 95 amendments made in the House on Wednesday, and they wound up putting some of them in. One of them is the interesting idea of the $500 million of the $28.5 billion that's going to be earmarked for transportation. The compromise was a really interesting one from the Democrats, say, let municipalities take charge of it. Maybe they can build their own light rail lines. Maybe we can move along to those 119 miles before 2020. That's unlikely to survive in the Senate. We also have the compromise on $35 million going to school security. We already have more going to education, but I think probably some of that money could certainly be used better going to education rather than a security plan that I'm guessing will be some kind of boondoggle. We've got to go through the Senate now. That's going to be a big place to fight over a lot of these compromises.
David, 6 House Republicans sided with the Democrats to pass this budget. Now it heads over to the Senate, and the news in the Senate was the budget that got out of there last week was a Democratic plan that a couple Republicans sided to make it happen. Do you think the final version of the budget is going to look a bit more Democratic?
Well, I think as Penfield can explain from a lot of personal knowledge, the long bill for funding the state government in general that eventually gets passed almost always is very, very, very similar to the long bill as created by the Joint Budget Committee. And as that bill moves through the rest of the legislature, things get added and subtracted. But by the time it's all done, it's very little difference from what the Joint Budget Committee of 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, all budget experts, proposes. It's unfortunate that we still have in this bill the Hollywood welfare provision. That's by which the taxpayers of Colorado gave Harvey Weinstein $3 million. And who can think of somebody more deserving of your taxpayer money than Harvey Weinstein?
Harvey Weinstein. I mean, that's a little bit of a stretch.
He's the producer of The Hateful Eight, which we gave $5 million to in Colorado, violating the film board's own regulations.
Did Miramax produce The Hateful Eight, or was it the Weinstein Company?
I guess I will look it up. Harvey Weinstein is on the credits of Hateful Eight.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
Okay. $35 million for school security grants is a great idea because there's lots of ways to spend money on education, but keeping students alive during the school day is about the highest possible one. And at Arapahoe High School, when there was a school resource officer, a sheriff's deputy, on the scene when a criminal came onto the property with a gun and started attacking people, 1 life was lost because the deputy courageously, opposite of the cowardly guy in Broward County, Florida, immediately engaged and stopped the killer and saved many lives. Simultaneously in the Senate, a separate bill, they passed unanimously a bill to ask the voters for approval for $3.5 billion in funding for transportation improvements. That is an important sign, and the unanimity from the Senate puts some pressure on the Democratic leadership of the House, which has essentially had the point of view that no, transportation, that's an extra thing. If you want to raise your taxes, you little people, you can go and do that. But the state budget core is certainly not for funding things like transportation. It's for Medicaid and the teachers' unions.
Penn, as David alluded, you have experience with this. You're a former state lawmaker. You've seen it from all different angles. What should we take away from the headlines about the House version this week, and what should we expect as we get closer to the end of the session?
Don't take much away from the House version of the bill. What will happen is the House passed its version of the bill. There were 90-some amendments offered. 33 amendments got on. But the context is the budget is $30 billion this year. I think all the amendments combined came in around 300, 400 million. So you're talking about 0.1% of the overall budget. It'll go to the Senate now, where the Senate will have its own share of amendments, kill a number of the House amendments, and it'll go into conference committee, and the conference committee is the JBC. So the JBC will get the bill in conference committee. The bill will go back to looking much like the bill the JBC initially introduced. Everybody will wring their hands, argue, fuss, and fight, and they'll pretty much pass the bill that the JBC wrote with a few exceptions. And normally those exceptions are those matters where you have bipartisan support in both chambers for the change. And so what's going to happen now is Democrats running the House will start talking with Republicans running the Senate and start figuring out what items they will agree on, so that when the conference committee meets, they'll have a pretty good idea of what the bill is, because they'll recommend that version to both sides. The transportation amendment is interesting because, as David alluded to, we've got Senate Bill 1 coming through, but it also did something very interesting. It created a carve-out so that the chamber could run its initiated measures this cycle, and if those aren't successful, certain things happen. I'm not convinced that carve-out's going to remain. And the amendment in the House that gave some of the money, transportation money, directly to local governments is pretty controversial, because usually you don't see state money go directly to local governments for transportation fixes, because counties and cities have their own ability to tax and spend, and so the state normally doesn't directly subsidize that. So you may see that in all likelihood roll out, because that impacts the larger transportation funding effort.
John, it seems that one of the few issues that Coloradans from around the state can agree upon is the need for better transportation roads. Do you think we'll see some sort of solution in this year's budget?
Well, I mean, the first request is for $495 million, so you would think that they would. I think one of the interesting aspects was the pension for para, to help bail out some of the workers that have lost money over the years because of bad investments by para and that kind of thing. You know, we had revenue growth this year, so everybody was fighting over these dollars, and so now that the Democrats have the edge, perhaps we won't see the same kind of thing we saw, you know, a few years back when we had a surplus and Owens came in and said, just because the president's given rebates, I'm going to give rebates in the state, at the state level. Tagging on to what Penn said about transportation going to local government, money going to local governments, I think where it gets confused is like in Denver, where you have US 40 running, you know, as Colfax, and then you have, 285 going through the city. You also have, you know, other 40 going through the city. So the bottom line is, state comes in and has to do those because those are federal roads. So that's where it gets kind of confusing, and maybe some of that money goes to that effort.
A newly released Magellan Strategies poll indicates Democratic gubernatorial candidate Kerry Kennedy is edging closer to Jared Polis. The results show Polis leading with 27% and Kennedy trailing with 23%, while Mike Johnston came in with 8% and Donna Lind trailing with 5%. David, this is a poll in March. The primary ballot does not get released until the middle of June. The final election day is June 26th. So there's a long way between now and the finish line. What impact does this poll make?
I think it's a big one. As you say, we've got 3 months to go. And so you look at statewide races that have happened in Colorado history or in other states. There are many, many, many where somebody who was 20 points or more down in the polls 3 months before the primary went on to win. So it's way too soon to start drafting the election day headlines. And obviously Mike Johnston, who's in the near the bottom of the race right now, he's going to have a $1 million spending at least by Michael Bloomberg on his behalf, so presumably that'll help some. But you got to say the impact now, it's huge, and it's great news for Kerry Kennedy. In terms of motivating her volunteers for the people who don't want Polis, she's the one to coalesce around for whatever reason people have for that. And not only will it help her get more volunteers, make her volunteers more enthusiastic, more hardworking, it'll also help with increasing campaign contributions and add to her credibility. Obviously, it's good for Polis to be the front runner, but you'd want him as the front runner to have a little more padding in the lead. Remember, there's also 1/3 of the votes are still undecided, so there's lots and lots that can happen before the primary.
Penn, with the different headlines we've seen from this race, Polis has made some, Kennedy's made some, and Johnson has made some, both with fundraising and turning in signatures. Were you surprised to not see more of a three-way race in this particular poll?
No, I wasn't. You know, at this stage in the campaign, the poll is really a name ID poll. And when you consider, and when you look at the Democratic primary field, of the 4 candidates, 3 have run for public office before, and Donna Lind, who's the lieutenant governor, was appointed, so she's never run for office before. So it's not surprising that the name ID of the three who have run for office before is higher. The big winner is undecided, where 36% of the people ended up. And frankly, that's where the prize is. That's where everybody's trying to get, because that's the margin you need to win. It is too soon. You know, part of what's remarkable is there's not been a lot of coverage, media coverage about any of the gubernatorial campaigns, really, which is sort of a function of us being a half newspaper town as opposed to a two newspaper town, which we were for so many years. So if you're a candidate, obviously any good news you want to talk about, but you can't get too high, nor can you get too low at this stage in the process, because the polling's early, it's name ID, and if you're Donna Lind, for instance, or Noel Ginsburg, who has since dropped out, and you weren't going through the caucus process, you didn't have a lot of name ID with the activists who were involved anyway, because you're going through the petition. Johnston's got an interesting decision to make now, because he's not going to hit 10% threshold, and so he's going to have to bow out of the caucus assembly process formally so that his petitions can keep him on the ballot. Because if he stays in both and doesn't hit 10%, it doesn't matter what the petitions do, he's off the ballot. So he's going to have to make an announcement pretty soon, and that's going to, I think, signal some weakness, Mike Bloomberg's $1 million in support notwithstanding.
That's a great point you brought up. I did not know that you have to. I know there are a couple candidates going to both sides. So I didn't realize that particular qualification. John, we've been talking about the headlines that Kennedy and Polis and Johnston have made. Really, the only headline we've seen from Donna Lind is the fact that she's not making any headlines. So how long can she see polls like this and not any other maybe positive headlines that keep some sort of momentum or hope to do well in the primary?
I don't think she has any momentum now, so I don't know that she can keep it going necessarily. I mean, David was right about this is so early that, you know, this is a time like when back with the mayoral race when we had Norm Early going against Wellington Webb. I'm sorry. We saw that he had a 43-3% lead, and then all of a sudden, one comment on DIA being DOA, all of a sudden the poll flipped like that, and Norm Early was never remembered after that. But the 10% threshold is a very good idea. What's going to hurt Kerry Kennedy, I think, is the fact that she was CFO for the city under Hancock, when in fact this hush money was paid off to the detective that is involved in this whole
But
process.
they didn't have to tell the CFO about that payment, right?
I'm sorry?
They didn't have to tell the CFO. Wasn't there some
But
legal
if you're the CFO, shouldn't you know where money is going? Shouldn't you know that there's a slush fund in the mayor's office?
But
shouldn't you know they have a pot of money that they use to make these payoffs to citizens who sue the city?
But if you can legally be gone around, it's kind of hard to say I should have known something, but I can be legally.
I would want to be, if I was a CFO of a company, I'd want to know where the money is going.
Sure, I can understand that point. Patty, when you see the headlines from these polls, does anybody have a real big reason to celebrate?
I think Kerry Kennedy does, and I don't think we were the ones who wrote the story that she didn't know about the payment, but that's because there is this fund and they don't have to go through the CFO. That's not going to stick to her. It's interesting that Kerry Kennedy has done as well as she has, and that Mike Johnston, who came out first, who's had a lot of money, hasn't done very well at all. He's a really good speaker, and maybe as people start hearing him, they will, when there are more debates, there are more public appearances, maybe he will start catching up, because with those 36% undecided can still make a big difference. But I think we have to remember, headlines don't matter anymore, because no one's reading daily papers, even if there are daily papers. So you've got social media. You have other ways to get the word out. And think about Bernie Sanders. Think about the surprises that come if people have a really good ground game. And I think in the next few weeks we'll see that.
I'll probably need to start adapting the topics to be like, this thing made Twitter posts this week, and that's a good point, Patty. Affordable housing issues made headlines for Twitter posts this week. Speaking of, first, a proposed facility for the homeless lost its bid to be built on federal land in Lakewood. Meanwhile, 9 News reported that 300 of the over 1,500 homes in Denver's affordable housing program are breaking some sort of covenant, and many will need to move and sell at a loss. We're getting towards the end of the show, Penn, but let me know what you think about either one of these pretty big big issues.
Well, both are important issues, and as a community, we need to understand we are behind the 8 ball in terms of affordable housing. I'm not talking about subsidized low-income housing. I'm talking about affordable housing for working families and individuals. We don't have enough of it, and if you want to see a quick cratering of our economic boom, stay behind the curve this much longer on this affordable housing issue. It's unfortunate that the Lakewood Initiative lost because it was desperately needed. The Denver piece is puzzling, only because when I look at the reaction of the city, I'm glad they have the program, but for them to say buyer beware is a concern. They ought to be tracking this to make sure that title companies and sellers and buyers are all aware of these restrictive covenants in terms of pricing. Otherwise, you're not going to have an affordable housing program that survives. So both of these are important stories because housing is so vital. We need to keep an eye on this.
John, the blame is probably going to a variety of areas for these houses, whether it's realtors or title companies or everything in between. But does the affordable housing program in Denver suffer from a credibility problem when you see headlines like this?
Well, for sure. I mean, the mayor had a 5-year plan to roll out affordable housing, and this sets that back tremendously. I mean, when you lose 300 homes out of that potential pod, and there's shenanigans going on with them, somebody's got to take the blame for this. And a great story by 9 News by getting that out. And somebody's, the buyers are going to suffer. The people who are selling are going to suffer. This is a major issue, and the city has got some work to do on this one.
Patty, where does this go from here?
Well, the city will, I think, have to really tie down the next $15 million it wants to put into affordable housing and make sure they can track the way everything is done and go back and audit the way it's been done over the last 15 years, because many of these deals are 10 years old and they just went south. The Lakewood situation is sad because under the McKinney Act, surplus federal property, there's an option for the homeless and homeless providers to bid on it. They put in a bid. It obviously needed to be worked on because it's a vast project, but the need is there. And if you want to see how well things work and how the homeless don't necessarily affect your bottom line, look at Lowry. That's the last big area where the McKinney Act made affordable and homeless housing possible. And I don't see Lowry's property values suffering.
David, wrap it up for us.
Affordable housing, as it is sometimes called, means specially subsidized housing for a small number of lucky people, whether that's with a direct government subsidy or indirectly through development rules that the city imposes. That only helps a few, and as we've seen today, those few sometimes turn around, flip the place, and sell it for a big profit. Affordable housing in the real world is dependent on just the market being able to provide at prices that middle-class people or others can afford the housing without having to have special government intervention. And that's a matter of zoning laws and construction codes that too often impede the ability of companies to build houses that people want to buy and can afford.
Let's get to our favorite part of the show, Disgrace of the Week. As always, Ms. Calhoun, please start us off.
Well, the long-running controversy over whether or not the mayor will be investigated, it was more than 4 weeks ago that Channel 7 had the first big report. We were supposed to hear by the time we taped last week whether or not there would be an investigation. Now the can's been kicked down the road till next week. Let's decide one way or the other.
Big surprise. David.
3,000 years ago, more than that, Pharaoh thought he could destroy all the Jews. And today, the people who hate the Jews and want to destroy them, like Louis Farrakhan, are welcome at the highest levels of the Democratic Party. The modern-day descendants of the Hitler Youth on college campuses shout down pro-Jewish speakers and attack them in mobs. But those people ought to recognize the lessons of history, and you can never destroy the Jews. They are the chosen people, and they're on the right side of history.
Penn.
Laura Ingraham, Fox News host, for going after David Hogue, the 17-year-old who was one of the Parkland, Florida shooting survivors, and criticizing him on a tweet for his comment about not being accepted to some colleges, even though he has a 4.2 GPA and got accepted to Cal Polytech. He then responded by encouraging advertisers to pull their ads, which they did. And now she's issued an apology. Shame on her for picking on a 17-year-old.
John.
I was just going to say that I would have loved to have seen more students at the rally last weekend.
Let's get to say something nice about somebody. Patty?
And he didn't take her apology either. We just issued our annual Orgy of Niceness, the Best of Denver, so I'm overwhelmed with niceness right now. But for the judge who saw that there were flaws to raise the bar, AKA raise the money, 71 that had passed, and struck down the part about the number of petitions, signatures that are needed on petitions. It's going to throw a lot of ballot measure causes up in the air over the next few months, but it's the right thing to let the citizens have more access.
David.
John's point is well taken. As the Washington Post story showed, only about 10% of the people at these rallies were under 18, and for the rest, the median age was 49. But for something really good, the legislature of Utah passed a bill to protect what's called free-range parenting, which says it's okay for parents to let children of an appropriate age walk, run, or bike to or from school, travel to commercial or recreational facilities, play outside, and remain at home unattended. And they passed that because in other states, child welfare agencies have literally been seizing children from their home and putting them in foster care for parents doing that same common sense thing. This is protective legislation that is needed everywhere.
I was probably raised free range. Penn.
I was going to say free range parenting sounds like parenting when I was growing up. So, John, with all due respect, I take issue with your comment. I'm really proud of what we're seeing in young people from young people in this country
I just wish there had
right
been
now.
more. That's all.
Because even if their numbers are not as vast in some of these rallies, the reality is they're driving the conversation. They're driving the awareness. And I'm telling you, this is feeling like the anti-Vietnam era all over again with these protests and what these kids are doing, staying in front of this issue. I'm proud of them.
We're showing our age.
John.
Yeah, I'm going to give Brother Jeff, who has his business right here in 5 Points, I'm going to give Brother Jeff a shout out because every week, every week, we're doing a 2 o'clock live Facebook Live show, and Tim Smith Investigation is involved in that as well.
We have one more Say Something Nice from one of our producers, Adrian Eatman, who is thrilled that Cooper is on his way home. Welcome home, Cooper. That is all the time we have for this edition of Colorado Inside Out. Be sure to take CIO wherever you go. We're on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, you name it, and we are there. You can also check out our podcast on iTunes or Google Play. For everyone here at Colorado Public Television, I'm Dominic Dezzutti. Happy Easter, happy Passover. If you don't celebrate either, have a great weekend. Good night.